All right, welcome. This is the second Abolition University session that Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty is presenting. And the topic today is the role of murder victim family members in the Death Penalty Abolition Movement. Really thrilled to have everybody participating in this session. We have an amazing group of panelists with us today. Renny Cushing is a New Hampshire state legislature and victim family member who has been involved in both the victim rights movement and the death penalty abolition movement for decades, and was our keynote speaker at the 2019 VADP annual awards luncheon. And it was just great having him with so many of our supporters last year. Also on this panel are three Virginia victim family members, Lanell Patterson, Rachel Sutfin, and Dave Knight. And they each will be sharing a bit of their stories with you all today. Just as a reminder, I have muted everybody for the call because otherwise the sound gets pretty funky and it can be rather chaotic. So if you have a question, please use the chat feature at the bottom of the bar to submit it. And so I'm going to turn things over to Renny well, before I do, one thing I wanted to mention that the death penalty in this country really rests, as I see it, on several key pillars of popular belief. One of them is that the death penalty is the only sure way to protect people from dangerous individuals. The second is that retribution is necessary and good for society. Essentially the idea that the SOBs deserve to die. And then finally, I think that what's most pernicious is this myth that some prosecutors promote, that only the death penalty can bring justice and closure to victim family members. And clearly the voice of many victim family members belies that. And the importance of victim family members is in demolishing some of these stereotypes and myths that keep us from our goal of abolition. So with that as an introduction, I want to invite and welcome Renny Cushing.
Thank you, Michael. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I just want to kind of acknowledge at the outset that speaking before the Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, is it Abolition University, about the impact or the role that family members of murder victims play and have played in the movement to abolish the death penalty in this country is kind of, to me, it's coming full circle because I know that one of the pioneering voices in this country for the family members of murder victims in opposition to the death penalty, it was Marie Deans, who was a founding mother and a stalwart of the abolition movement and in Virginia, of the criminal justice reform movement. I'm looking forward to listening to Linell and Rachel and Dave. I want to just give a quick overview of the role that family members of murder victims play in the death penalty, and want to go back to the end, the final days of the litigation strategy that was adopted by the NAACP to put an end to apartheid, to legal discrimination in this country. One of the components of that, and the only one that was not along racial lines, was to challenge the death penalty. Because it was seen as a vestige of slavery in this country in the way that it was applied and used. And that was successful. It culminated in 1972 with the Furman decision that declared that the death penalty was then unconstitutional. What happened then, though, is the opposition to the death penalty, it was a litigation-based strategy. It was focused entirely upon the death penalty and how it was imposed upon those upon whom it was imposed. And because it was a litigation strategy, at the moment that it succeeded in 1972 and the death penalty was outlawed, the debate shifted from the courthouses to the state houses because there was not in place kind of the infrastructure to sustain that change in our public policy. And for the next 25 years, you saw in state after state after state, proactive efforts to reinstate the death penalty that oftentimes were led by the public face of those were family members of murder victims. And there was a paradigm, and there was a paradigm and still is a paradigm in this country that presumes that all family members of murder victims want the death penalty, that they need it in order to have some kind of balm for their pain, and that our policy leaders are under almost a moral obligation to provide this execution solution to victims' pains. And it became synonymous with caring for victims is imposing the death penalty. Now, interestingly enough, when the death penalty was reinstated in '76, that also coincided with the emergence of something else from grew out of the civil rights movement, and that was the movement that became known as the victims' rights movement. And it was driven primarily from communities where the rights of people who were not recognized as having value to have their lives and safety protected by the public were feeling doubly victimized, had a criminal justice system that didn't respond to their needs, and also primarily from the women's movement. Because at the time, what was recognized, what were gender crimes were not even recognized as such. So that, if you weren't a virgin and you were raped, that was not a crime. If you were beaten by your spouse, then that's part of his chattel that we're entitled to. So there developed this movement, grassroots movement, to assert the rights of crime victims. And it has evolved over the past 40 years. So you have the crime victims movement moving forward, and you have the abolition movement moving forward. And they came from the same roots. For a long time, they had no conversation. And part of it was because, I think, going back to the abolition movement, its roots with litigators. The one thing that you don't want to have when you're focusing in on how the death penalty impacts a defendant, the person accused of crime, is to have this distraction of the impact that the actions have had upon somebody else. You don't want victims in the courtroom. They weren't supposed to be part of it. But when the conversation and the public debate shifted, because historically the movement had been led by litigators, they quite frankly floundered and just, lawyers really suck in the legislature. They just don't. I mean, it's an entirely different process. And what they did is, it's not about fact and logic, but in many ways, legislation is about, telling a story and creating a narrative and appealing as much to the hearts and minds of people as it was an intellect. And you saw time and again, the abolition movement itself would see, because it had never really had conversations with victims. I will say that it did not have a lot of conversations with victims, was not concerned necessarily about the victim experience, did not, because it was the death penalty was seen through the lenses of the offender, victims were just marginalized. And the presumption was that if you're a family member who opposed a murder victim who opposed the death penalty, you either must be like a psycho or a saint, or maybe you didn't really love your family member. If you did, you'd want that. There were just a lot of reasons for that. You weren't treated as someone who, had very valid reasons for themselves, not caring about the offender, but for themselves, to oppose the death penalty. I mean, I know that in my instance, my father was murdered 3 decades ago. And, to me, the most important question was not what should we do with the offender. The most important question I had to deal with is, what do we do with the empty chair at the kitchen table? What do we do with the emptiness in our heart? I remember a week, several days, a few days after my father was murdered, a bill came in the mail, and it was from the town ambulance corps. It was for taking my father's corpse, he'd been murdered in my family home, to the hospital, to the emergency room. And I remember my mother saying, I can't believe I have to pay for my father's murder. But that was the reality, is everyone's focused in at that moment of the crime, and let's apprehend someone, let's focus on the criminal, and really, and victims get completely abandoned. So to me, it was not a zero-sum game. It was understanding that, victims get kept in the dark about what takes place in their crime. Their material and real needs get neglected. And people forget about that, because you don't want to get too close to somebody who's had somebody murdered, because our socialization is such we don't expect that would happen. And if we get close to somebody who's been murdered, it might might be contagious. There must be something wrong with it. Anyway, I may have talked to, I'm not sure how long I should be talking, Michael, about this, but I'm trying to set the context for it. And I will say, kind of a monumental thing happened in 1998. It was either the high point or the low point of the death penalty movement in America, when in Massachusetts, the state was a bastion of opposition. There was a murder of an 8-year-old boy named Jeffrey Curley, who was lured by pedophiles, murdered, sodomized, and thrown to New Hampshire. And his father, Bob Curley, led a crusade to reinstate the death penalty in Massachusetts, and it was successful, to the point where both houses of the legislature voted to reinstate it. It became the 39th state since '76 to reinstate the death penalty. But there was a moment of pause when one legislator changed his mind and decided to change his vote. So the motion to reinstate the death penalty was tied, so the motion didn't fail. But what happened from that moment forward, because it was the face of abolition, is that I think people began organizing, and it was the voices of victims coming into the legislative process, trying to not challenge people, because we always have empathy and identity. I always, have more in common with someone who has had somebody murdered who supports the death penalty than someone who hasn't but opposes the death penalty, because there is this fundamental part of our lives that's forever transformed. But I think there was kind of a coalescing of family members of murder victims who, from a victim-centered perspective, opposed capital punishment, that in many ways clawed our way into the death penalty abolition movement. And at the same time, what was happening in the victims movement was, for victims advocates, it was becoming, support of the death penalty became synonymous with supporting a victim who wanted capital punishment. Again, buying into the paradigm. So there was a period of time when both proponents and opponents of the death penalty conceded that victims' family members wanted the death penalty, and both there were like rights that were in conflict. I'll tell more about that, but I know that one of the things I ended up doing is, when I became involved in the Death Penalty Abolition Movement, was writing a booklet called Dignity Denied, which kind of documented what happens if you were in case again, if you were a victim, a murder victim, family member of a murder victim, and you oppose the death penalty, all of a sudden, many of the rights and privileges that you were entitled to under the victims' rights laws are denied you, because there was, again, a presumption on the part of some victims' advocates that you were not a worthy victim. That, again, you were not entitled to your opinion to be opposed to the death penalty, because it was an unhealthy thing to do. And we've had that time and again with victims advocates, and that's part of the movement. But from that Dignity Denied booklet, I introduced it at a meeting of the National Organization of Victims Assistance, because NOVA had put out a training film, a video called Finding Resolution. And the purpose was to help train victim advocates to help victims, but to help victims through an execution. But the limit of the film, it included only victims who either, the decision was, do we watch the execution or do we not watch the execution? Totally missing from the video were family members and victims who opposed executions and who were trying to stop executions. And there was an inability that you could see inherent in having victims advocates part of the prosecution, an inability to kind of reconcile the victims who they're supposed to serve, their opposition to the death penalty, with the decision by the boss that the state was going to put this person to death. And time and again, we see that play out. Anyways, that's to set a context. For the past couple decades, what we've seen emerge is an understanding on the part of the victims movement, first of all, because once I challenged NOVA on that video, they took it down. They developed a new protocol so that they have to recognize and acknowledge that not all family members want the death penalty. We also saw a movement in some places to establish Crime Victim Equality Act legislation that says, it doesn't matter how you feel about the death penalty, whether you're for it, against it, or don't know, if you're a victim of crime, you're entitled to be treated with dignity, respect, and all those rights associated with it. So anyways, and I have played a role for the past 20 years. I know as a victim survivor, I sponsored legislation in New Hampshire to oppose the death penalty. And again, always did it from that, because what the voices of victims have the ability to do in the death penalty debate is to shift the conversation, to shift the tone, so that what you really need to be able to do as a public policy maker, as a lawmaker, is to come to understand that you can oppose the death penalty, and you can be both pro-victim and also anti-death penalty. And in fact, there's a certain consistency there once you get below the rhetoric and once you understand the nuances and understand the importance of the values that victims hold on to, that they don't want to yield to the act of murder, and they don't want the state yielding to the act of murder, that are really important lessons. And it's not easy, because as a victim survivor, you're constantly in a situation of having traumatic memories, energized, of undergoing, being in a part of vicarious trauma. But I think in every instance in the past 2 decades, in every legislative battle where the death penalty has been abolished, it has been the presence of family members in the legislative arena setting the tone to confront and dissipate and turn back the paradigm that all family members want the death penalty. So that's, I don't know if that's too much or not enough, Michael, but I don't, I'm mindful. I want to listen to Linell and Rachel and Dave.
Well, thank you, Renny. And that long overview or long historical overview, I think, is really important for us to set the context for victim family members. And I feel really privileged to know the following 3 people and thank them for their willingness to speak. So I want to begin by introducing Lanell Patterson. She is one of the first victim family members that I met here in Virginia, and really helped me to understand the perspective of family members and helped me to be a better director and leader of this movement in Virginia. So Linell, we're thrilled to have you, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's fascinating to listen to Renny, because I was really resonating with just so many aspects of it. So the first thing I was thinking about, my dad and stepmom were murdered in 2001. So I was a sophomore in college. And it was a devastating crime. But listening to Renny, I found out about almost all of the details day by day by reading the newspapers and by watching the news. So like the first day, we found out that it was my stepbrother and 3 of his friends. The second day, we found out that there were knives and hammers involved. The third day, we found out that there were 4 hours of torture, that there was a chase, that there was duct tape. The next day, we found out that there was sexual deviance, that they were shot, that they were both ultimately suffocated to death. So it was just all by newspapers. And then by the end of the week, we had all this kind of crazy information. And then the police called and kind of reviewed and confirmed and kind of talked to us a little bit. But it's just fascinating to kind of think back on that and just identify with, yeah, no one's really comfortable talking about it ever. So I was kind of trying to think about how to distill down kind of the main reasons on how I land it in being a really active person in the anti-death penalty movement. And I think there were three main things that happened during the trial that really shifted me. And I think in my heart, I always leaned towards being against the death penalty, but it was not drilled down in any capacity. And at this point, I cannot tell you why I leaned against it initially. But in the beginning of the trials, my sister and I, who is also an active member in anti-death penalty work, we were brought into a room with the prosecuting attorney. So the person who was representing Dad and Lucy. And he asked us how we felt about the death penalty. And we were kind of like, I don't know, it's not for us. And being asked at all was incredibly empowering because the prosecuting attorney, he was sharp, he was on it, he was smart, he clearly knew what he was doing. And when we told him that we didn't think that this was the path for us, I will just never forget, he leaned back in his chair and he said, doesn't actually matter what you think. I am going to pursue the death penalty. It wouldn't matter if anyone told me not to. So all of a sudden, any power that we thought we had, and let me just say, a victim doesn't actually have a lot of power in the situation at all, whether or not they're led to believe that they do. But anything that we thought we had was taken away. And it was already a situation where you just are out of control anyway. So my sister and I kind of took an untraditional path at that point. And I think a lot of that was because we felt so out of control that we decided to figure out like if there was a way to pursue anti-death penalty work within this trial. So what we did was we went up to the defense attorney and we said, hey, we're against the death penalty. Let us know if we can help in any capacity. And what he said to us was, well, if you speak to Lan and May, so let me back up a second. There were 4 people who were ultimately charged with murder. 3 of them pled guilty to all of their crimes. One, Lan and May, who was my age, he was 19, he did not plead guilty to sexual deviance, so he was thrown into a trial by jury. He was the only one who had that. So the defense attorney said, well, Lan and May has not yet said, I'm sorry. And if you talk to him and he says, I'm sorry, maybe you can say that in the punishment phase of the trial and it will be counted as a mitigating circumstance. It will be counted kind of as a pro for him. And so my sister and I kind of were like, what have we done? But we're gonna go ahead and do this. So we sat down. We were taken to the prison. There was a panel of glass between Landon and us. And because Megan and we each needed to be part of the conversation, I had a phone, my sister had a phone, and Landon had 2 phones. And throughout all of this, kind of thinking about how we learned about the crimes through the newspapers, we were told that he was a monster. We were told that he was this dark kind of soil in the world. We were told that he was evil. And it was like my own personal fairy tale villain in the truest sense. And this is the kind of the first thing that impacted me was that sitting across from this person who was my age, who had acne, who couldn't make eye contact, it rehumanized him for me. Like, if anything actually gave me back any sense of power, it was sitting in front of this person who all of a sudden wasn't this like larger than life character who was evil. So that was one of the things. He did say, I'm sorry. We always took it with a grain of salt because who knows if he meant it or not. And ultimately, we weren't even allowed to talk in the trial because it was considered hearsay, but it continues to be this really powerful moment in my life. Okay, so that was the first thing. The second thing was then proceeding through the trials, having been active in working against the death penalty. And every single day, they talked about how they were seeking justice for me over and over for the victims' family members. We need to get this person the death penalty for justice for the family members. And so it felt like salt in the wound. It felt like insult to injury that we had so clearly demonstrated our personal desires, and even the language didn't shift. So this was the second thing. And the third thing, and probably the biggest thing, was during one of the bathroom breaks during this trial, there were 3 women who came up to my sister and I, and it turned out that they were Landon May's family. So I met his aunt and his cousin, and I struggled to kind of describe the immediate connection that we had. Because at that point in my life, I was connecting in very difficult capacities with most people in my life, because just no one could understand this raging turmoil. But these women got it. Like they were devastated in a very similar way to me. It was the opposite side of the coin for sure, but there was an alignment. And Landon May was ultimately sentenced to death. And I remember their tears. I remember their cry. I remember it now. And I continue to think that, like, we experienced a very similar loss. And again, in like very different universes, but there was a connection there that, again, like it just kind of reinforced the fact that I don't need this person to die for me. And certainly not if it is going to make a whole other family grieve in the same way that I have grieved. I think one thing to know is that I didn't not delve into like a darkness myself. So like I also experienced rage and devastation and loss like I've never previous or since. So it's not that I don't understand people wanting the death penalty. Right? I think the power in us telling our stories is that like some people really feel like that is important, right? And then other people really feel like it's not. And then other people really feel like they're angry, so they want to commit murders, but you are not allowed to take action steps based on these feelings, right? So you acknowledge everyone's allowed to feel everything, and then you're left exploring this system. And what we know about the system is that it's racist and that it's not great for the economy and that it kills innocent people occasionally. So I think that is kind of my quick and dirty on how I got to where I am. And I still feel like it's all still developing and rolling. But those are kind of some concrete stepping stones that I went through.
Thank you so much, Linell. Thank you for your honesty and your willingness to speak, not only today, but many times publicly. I've been on panels with Linell multiple times through the years, and I just have enormous respect for her. I now want to introduce Rachel Sutphin, who is another victim family member that I've gotten to know fairly well over the last few years because of her involvement in the abolition movement. She also has a very powerful story to tell. So welcome, Rachel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. As he said, I am Rachel Sutphin. I have been working alongside the VADP for the last 4 years. My father, Corporal Eric Sutphin, was a deputy with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, and he was killed by William Morver on August 24th, 2006, on a hiking trail near Virginia Tech. William Morver had escaped from the hospital, and when my father encountered him, he was killed. I was 9 years old at the time, and I did not know much of the trial. However, the trial did take 10 years, and at the end, I was able to become more active and engaged in advocating against the death penalty. I wrote many letters to legislators as well as the governor. However, the then Governor McAuliffe, he did not respond to me, and he later denied clemency, and Morva was executed in July 2017. The hardest thing for me was the no response from the governor, because I felt that this government, who I've been taught is here to protect me, has denied even hearing my voice. And especially as towards the end, I learned of the questions of Morva's mental illness, and then the Hungarian government got involved, wanting us to send him there. And all these voices were coming in saying, this is not right. And yet our government still went ahead and proceeded with the measure, saying once again, it is justice for us, but it is not the justice that I felt a need for. I continue to speak in both public settings as well as writing letters to politicians to advocate against the death penalty, because as a murder victim family member, the death penalty did not bring me any solace, but instead lengthened the trial, and it used up resources that could have aided my family. I believe the death penalty is an outdated punishment, and it needs to be banned in order for family members to be protected and aided, as well as to promote true justice in our government system. I'm open to any questions, but that is my story.
Yeah, we're going to hold questions till the end. But thank you, Rachel. Rachel has had a couple op-eds published, one supporting the bill to exempt people with severe mental illness a couple years ago. That was in the Bristol newspaper. And last year, she had an op-ed published by the Washington Post calling for abolition of the death penalty. She also spoke at a press conference that we did in November last year, announcing the 13 victim family members who had endorsed a sign-on letter calling for abolition of capital punishment. And all three of our panelists today signed that letter. So let me now introduce Dave Knight. Dave, actually I don't know Dave as well as his father. His father is an Episcopal priest that I've known through the years. So Dave will tell about his story now. So welcome, Dave, and we look forward to hearing from you. Assuming there, I got you unmuted now. So welcome, and go ahead.
Well, thank you everybody for being here. This is the first time I've engaged at this level with VADP, and I just didn't really know what to expect. What I didn't expect was the onslaught of emotions and just recounting everything. And I just want to thank first Renny, Rachel, and Lanell for your sharing. It took me somewhere I really wasn't expecting. Probably should have, but again, hey, this is my first time. I kind of came into the idea of the death penalty being wrong. It had always kind of been an academic argument. My then girlfriend, now wife, when we met in college, in that time of like trying to figure out, okay, what are belief structures? You know, what do you feel about the future? How do you feel about this? We pretty extensively interviewed each other on our belief structures and what we felt about this and what we felt about that. And we came down to discussing death penalty, and both of us seemed pretty set in our beliefs, so far that we even went so far as to try and construct in our heads, well, what if this happened? And what if this person did this, and this was me, and this was, and in that, that totally safe academic, world of, well, it's not really happening. So like we can really be, who knows if that's really what we feel, but neither of us could come up with a situation in that academic framework of when it would be okay. And so we agreed on a lot of other things too. And in 1995, we got married. And in 1997, January 31st, very early Friday morning, I found myself seated next to her driving down from Reston to Richmond. We had gotten a call at about 1 in the morning saying that my brother Jamie had been shot and that we needed to get down there pretty quickly. And so, being pulled out of a deep sleep, not knowing what's going on, not even beginning to be able to process that, I had two thoughts going through my head. Both of them, I was thinking about them so maybe they wouldn't come to fruition. But again, all I knew was he'd been shot and we were on the way down there. This is before cell phones, we couldn't, before GPS. So we were really kind of isolated for those 2 hours with, nothing to do. She was concentrating on the road and I was concentrating on trying to keep my sanity. And the two vivid pictures I kept having over and over in my head is, what if, he comes out of surgery and, he's on life support and we have to figure out, okay, do we pull the plug or not? That was one thought I had going through my head. And then once I allowed my head to go there, I went even farther and I said, oh my gosh, what if he doesn't pull through? And, what if, it would be murder? And what if they go ahead with the death penalty? And that was where I really started thinking, oh my gosh, if that ever ends up happening, there's going to be video footage of me out in front of a prison, at 12:01 on some morning with me holding a sign, do not kill this guy. And so I kind of was thinking about those things, and again, kind of in a weird sort of way, kind of hoping that neither of them wouldn't have to cross either of those bridges. But as we got there, we went into the room where he was. It took a little while for me to figure out exactly what was going on, because I couldn't figure out why he wasn't in an operating room somewhere being, operated on. Why aren't they trying to save him? And that's when reality came crushing down and said, they're not saving him because they can't. And that started that process there. And I remember very specifically standing in the room where he was when the police called in because they had captured the two guys who had committed the crime. There was a robbery at the Friendly restaurant where he was working. And they had them, they were booking them, and they needed to know what to charge them with, whether it was going to be murder or attempted murder. And when they said it was going to be murder, it just really solidified what was happening. And I remember, I remember going to trial, and the two gentlemen involved, one of them had worked at the restaurant previously and apparently had a rap sheet a mile long, but given that they hadn't done the background check that they would have, that was not so known. But the Anthony, the 17-year-old kid, as he was in my mind for the longest time, he had never been caught doing anything, and he was the one that actually had accidentally pulled the trigger. And I remember there being some discussion of, well, had the roles been reversed and it had been Sal Webb, the one that had the previous rap sheet, that if he had pulled the trigger, they could have gone with the death penalty. And I just remember being very, very, very thankful that that wasn't something that was, the Commonwealth was not going to face that, to pursue that. And I just remember being very, very relieved about that. And I remember explaining that to a couple of people, and again, that idea of people like, what do you keep, wouldn't you want him dead? But again, in that, the walls of the academic argument were down. This was real life. This was, what was happening. I was really, I felt validated in my beliefs that, okay, yes, even in this situation, and we hadn't come up exactly with the situation, but I still felt very much, even more so that, Jamie's dead, and there's nothing that can bring him back. And what really sunk into it for me was, I don't want somebody else to be killed in his name. I mean, if you knew Jamie, and I'm looking at faces here of people who I know knew him, and that wasn't his style. He was the easiest, most fun-loving, somewhat meddlesome and troublesome, but what's an older brother going to say? But what I recently read Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, and she summed it up there, and it was also a sentiment that was from one of the survivors of the Murrah building bombing. And it was the idea of that nobody's death will ever replace a life. I mean, there's nothing that is going to bring Jamie back. And again, the sentiment of, I don't want another family going through that. I mean, there were definitely 2 lives that were lost on July 31st or January 31st, Jamie's, but also Anthony's. I mean, his life changed forever. And how do you pick up the pieces and move forward? And so, I don't think there's ever a reason to celebrate anybody's death. And so that's kind of where I am now with the death penalty, and I'm happy to be any part of making it go away. I mean, I'm aware that, it's nice to see that there are a couple of people that feel the same way I do, with the, that being that victims. But that's just kind of where I've landed right now, and I'm happy with it, and I'm happy to be a part of this, and have met 4 new friends today that, again, I'm very, very grateful for, what you've done and what you've experienced, and for your willingness to share. And again, just happy to be part of this.
Dave, before we open this up to the participants, you had mentioned that one of the perpetrators of your brother's homicide is being considered for parole. That must be an enormously difficult thing for you and your family to deal with.
It certainly is. It's the new reality. It's what happens next. For me, it's a constant reminder that nothing ever goes away. It's not something you ever get over, but you get through it, and this is the next step. And a lot of those emotions that were so close to the surface, 24 years ago, were brought right back. I've got 2 fantastic brothers that I love dearly, and we're closer than anything. But we're all in very different places, and my folks are in different places too. They're on the line, so I hope they don't mind me talking about this. But it's again something. We're all different, and we are a very close family. So that's one of the things that makes it difficult, because we're so close. And when a piece of that is taken away, I think it was Renny who had said, you're not thinking about what what happened to you. You're thinking about the empty seat at the table. And I remember very early on, when we would all get together, having us all together made it that much more clear what was missing. And so that was difficult. But I think we're all in different places with this, and that's okay. But it certainly is interesting. I'll be crafting a message to a group of people who I've never met before, who I don't know, who will ultimately have the say as to whether or not this guy is allowed to leave prison and start maybe a better life, or a different life, or knowing at the full time that Jamie won't. And so it's one thing, again, it's that academic situation where my wife was on the board of the Offender Aid Restoration, here in Arlington, working on providing supports for offenders coming out of prison, and volunteered, gave money, gave time. Again, she was on the board, and looking at it from that angle was slightly different than the lens I'm looking through. And now that it's that it's Anthony that's kind of up for possibly coming out, and who knows what's going to happen, but we will get through it. We'll get to the next step. I have the fullest of confidences in that. Again, my family is fantastic. I would not have made it through at 1997 if it hadn't been for them. So.
Okay, thank you. It just, what you said just reminded me of a comment that Senator Janet Howell, a state legislator here in Virginia, mentioned during a debate on a death penalty related bill, probably at least 10 years ago. During the debate, she said, I used to support the death penalty, and then my father-in-law was murdered in a home invasion. And you talked about how close your family was, and she talked about how the anger got turned inward among her own family members when there were differences of opinion about whether the prosecutor should seek the death penalty in that homicide. And she said for the first time, she considered what the death penalty did to victim family members and understood for the first time how much discord it could sow, so much so that it could destroy a family that was once close. And so she said, because of that experience, she then opposed the death penalty, and since then has been very outspoken at the legislature through the years. So, yeah. So again, thank you to all the panelists. Renny, I want to give first word to you if any of the comments of Linell, Rachel, or Dave struck anything about you and anything you would like to share before we open it up to questions.
Well, I think everything they said struck close to me. It's interesting now. This is the first time I've ever participated in a Zoom meeting to talk about homicide, to talk about things that are just so part of my core being. And I'm just grateful to the three of them to be able to meet or converse like this. I do know that one thing about the death penalty, one of the reasons I don't like the death penalty is that it offers up, in offering up this execution solution to victims' pain, I think the advocates of the execution solution don't really have an understanding about the healing process, about the psychobiology of trauma, because you don't get better by an event. You just, you don't get better. There's nothing about putting someone else to death that all of a sudden is going to lift the burden from you. But what I find really sad, incredibly sad, is to see victim survivors focus so much upon their loved one, how their loved one died, and focus so much upon the killer, that in the process they end up forgetting how their loved one lived. And it is not just, it is when the death penalty claims or murder claims more than one victim, not only is the person in the grave, but also the victim survivor who, there's no easy way through this. There's no way around it. You just muddle along and hope that things improve. And that's half the struggle, I think, is to come to grips with the fact, for every victim survivor, it's really hard to come to grips with the fact that, much as you want to, you can't change the past. What you can do is make some decisions about the future and try to, I think, honor the life of the person that you lost. Because at the end of the day, the death penalty doesn't do the one thing that we all really want. It doesn't bring our loved one back.
Yeah. One question that I was asked via text was, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy." And the question is, has this been your experience? So I'll just open it up to any of the four of you.
Essentially, the Sermon on the Mount was picked because it's also the line that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." And that is the scripture that those who support the death penalty in my area were using, saying they were the peacekeepers because they were killing this man who is a harm to society. However, the definition of peace is different for me, and the definition of mercy is different for me. So claiming, what is the message of the entire gospel that shows mercy versus picking out what applies and what labels you want to label yourself versus what labels we have been told should be claimed by us. I'm also a seminary student, so the Bible does speak some to me.
The one question was about, I think was aimed at Linell. Did you form any relationship with the defendant? And I'm not sure if, if you'd care to comment on that or not, but it was directed to you.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So two things. One, in the following years, I did exchange some letters. Truly, they were very surfacey, and I was not interested in knowing day-to-day things about, my intention, truly, I'm not totally sure what my intention was, but it was something more than surface. So that's one thing, but I did, and so that was with Landon, who is on death row. He's still on death row. I did go through a restorative justice process where my sister and I were able to speak with my stepbrother. That is not actually available for people on death row in Pennsylvania. So I don't have the opportunity to do this in a process that actually feels healthy. It was shockingly helpful in continuing to shift towards healing to meet with my stepbrother. I didn't expect a lot out of it, and I got a lot out of it. So I do wish that I could do that with Lan and May potentially, but as of now, it's not allowed.
All right, I see that we're coming up on 4 o'clock, and that is our scheduled time to end. And so I'll just leave it to any of our panelists if there's any closing word you would like to share with the group before we end this session. All right. Well,
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I want to thank you for the work in Virginia, and I hope that all of you go forward and help make things just a little bit better by abolishing the death penalty in your Commonwealth. And good luck, and let me know anything I can do to help. It's really important.
Thank you, Renny. God willing, next year that we'll have the votes to abolish. We're cautiously optimistic that next year will be our year. A lot of things will have to break right for that to happen, but let's hope and let's pray that that is the case. So thank you again to everybody for your participation. Renny, it sounds like you have one more word.
It's just what's burning in me is that story about Terry McAuliffe refusing to answer the letter. It's just enraging. I say that as someone who's a public official and a survivor of homicide.
Can I ask, Michael, are there action steps that we can be taking in the next 3 to 6 months?
I would ask everybody to if you don't know, find out who your state delegate and state senator is, and sometime in the coming weeks to contact him or her and let them know that you want to see an end to the death penalty in 2021. And that's going to be very, very important that every one of our 100 state delegates and our 40 state senators hear from their constituents that it's time. And particularly for those who have some experience of violent crime or homicide, to share that with your legislator and saying that that is where your opposition comes from. Because folks who come from that vantage point have enormous moral credibility in the public arena. And so again, thank you. And I have a note from Nancy Haight at Death Penalty Focus. We're creating a webinar about the effects of the death penalty on family members, and that so she'll let us know about that, and I'll publicize it among our supporters. So we're a few minutes over. Thank you to everybody for participating. Take good care and be well, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Love you, Jim.